Are you married or in a committed relationship looking for real advice on having love and enriching your relationship? You are in the right place. Welcome to The Couples Expert with Stuart Fensterheim.
Hello, and welcome to the Couples Expert podcast. This is Stuart Fensterheim, the Couples Expert. And today we're going to be talking about boundaries in a relationship. There are many different boundaries that people can set in their lives. And in your relationship, you need to be clear about what your boundaries are. Hopefully, by the time you develop a long-term relationship, you are clear within yourself what type of boundaries are appropriate for you and what aren't. But that's not always the case. So today, what we're going to do is really pull apart boundaries and really understand what is it going to take to have a healthy boundary in a relationship. And do the two of you define this the same way? What I hope is happening is that both of you are listening to this podcast, because my desire would be that as a result of this podcast, the two of you would be able to have a conversation that would allow you to really understand the needs that you have in a relationship and what some of the healthy boundaries are and what are the lines that each of you have that the other person shouldn't cross, and how to assess your relationship and how your relationship as it exists today is with regards to the boundaries that you now have, and are they appropriate, and more importantly, are they healthy? Let's start out, though, by talking about, are boundaries even necessary in a relationship? Or if you have to set a boundary, is it a bad thing? I think there's a belief that our partners should always know what our wants and needs are and what are some of the limits that we have, because doesn't everyone have the same limits? And I would say absolutely not, because there are very few things that are not open to talk about. And I think so many people have this misconception that two people who love each other know, and it's almost this mind reading that we feel like we should be able to do. But boundaries are something that most couples never really talk about. I think sometimes we talk about boundaries such as cheating, but when it comes to things like boundaries of time alone or boundaries of when are we interested in being intimate, or boundaries that might be about, do we want to have a very active social life? I can't tell you that there are so many couples that I see in my office that the absolute worst fights seem to be about their social life, about how frequently, how many things do we do separately and how many do we do as couples. And I think we have to be clear that all relationships have boundaries. The most important piece of this is they need to be clearly defined. They need to be not only talked about in general terms, but they need to be very specifically discussed. And it doesn't have to be a wall or a electric fence, but they should be clearly defined boundaries so that both of you understand what each of you needs and wants in a relationship, having to do with many, many different aspects. Because the critical part of it is that the boundaries in romantic relationship are about feeling close, of feeling intimate, of feeling like your wants and needs are important to your partner. One of the things that I talk a lot about is part of why I'm so passionate about emotionally focused therapy is that two people can come together, and the experience that you can have is an experience in which you know you're with that one person in the world that loves you more than anything and has your back. If you're with someone that you interpret and you experience that the boundaries you set get violated over and over and over again, you're not going to feel that passion, that love, that feeling of someone having your back. you're going to have the experience that you have to watch your back. And there's nothing worse to a relationship than feeling like you have to have that. Today's podcast is sponsored by Before You Tie the Knot, 12 Essential Conversations. Planning a wedding and a future together can be stressful, and the couples expert is here to give you a little bit of relief. Whether it's now or in the future, the decision to marry is one of the most important decisions you'll ever make. We don't know what we don't know, so I've produced a 12-week course for you and your partner called Before You Tie the Knot, 12 Essential Conversations to Have Before You Marry. There isn't a lot of premarital training and education out there, so I've created 12 modules that address the challenges you and your partner are likely to face as you enter into married life. This course is taken at your pace. There's no time pressure, and I've included some fun challenges and bonus exercises for you and your partner to explore and learn together. I'll be lending support as you go through the course by live Q&A sessions and discussions in a Facebook group exclusively for those of you going through the program. Before You Tie the Knot covers many of the issues and discussions that couples need to have before they get married, included family planning, finances, work-life integration, spirituality, and more. Go to www.thecouplesexperts.com for Before You Tie the Knot and find out what you need to know for a successful and happy marriage. Healthy boundaries include everything from speaking up when you're feeling disrespected or you have to advocate for yourself, and also how do you have the time that you need for your own interests. One of the things I was sharing with someone the other day is I am passionate about theater. Theater is something that I was raised with, and as a matter of fact, at another time in my life, actually was trying to be an actor on Broadway. And by the way, that didn't work, as you know, or I would be standing on a stage acting as opposed to standing on a stage talking to all you fine people. But my wife is not as passionate about theater. She'll go periodically, but it's really an interest of mine. If she stood in the way of me doing that and said, I don't want you going to a theater because I don't want to go, that would not work for us. Because this passion, this creative part of me is such an important piece. It's really the thing that jazzes me up more than anything is attending Broadway shows. And as some of you know, I just got back from New York and I saw a couple of shows, which was so very exciting. And my wife went along with me, which was so very much a love language of mine that I feel so much closer to her that we did that. But if she put a limit, a boundary in that said I couldn't go to things by myself, that just wouldn't work. And so talking about that, and part of that is being very self-aware of what your needs are. And that's a real challenge for some of us. We haven't asked the right questions. We don't know where are our limits, where are our boundaries. And part of self-awareness is that knowledge. And then being clear with your partner about what your needs are. But unless you know what they are, how could you communicate that with anyone? And being specific and direct with them also means being vulnerable. Sometimes the boundaries that we set in a relationship have to do with other people. And one of the big debates that I have with a lot of folks is it okay to have friends of the opposite sex, for example? And sometimes the reason that someone might say, yes, it's okay, or no, it's not, has to do with past relationships. And when you're talking about boundaries and you're talking about setting limits for yourself and your partner, you have to share where that limit comes from. Why do you need that limit? Is it something from a deep emotional need because there are trust violations in your past, not only with your past relationships that you've had as an adult, but perhaps there have been betrayals also having to do with your primary caretaker, with the person who raised you. Maybe your father had an affair on your mother, and maybe it started out because they had a friendship with someone that then turned into something bigger than that. If that's where your boundary comes from, you have to talk about it. Another possibility is sexual abuse. If you've experienced sexual abuse in your past, what you're willing or unwilling to do sexually may be related to your past issues. If you're not talking about those limits and those sexual practices that you're comfortable or uncomfortable with, I had a woman the other day who said when their partner touches their right breast in a certain way, they just dissociated. They are unable to be present and to be intimate because flashbacks come flooding forward, and they never shared that with their partner. So we have to be able to share these kinds of things, which obviously then requires two people to have a trusting relationship with one another that allows you to be vulnerable in that way. So when we're trying to be specific and direct, it's not on the surface. That specificity and directness has to be about trusting of our partner and knowing our partner wants to understand where we're coming from. So that when you're talking in a vulnerable way, when you're talking about these boundaries, you have to talk about it in a way that communicates love and connection and a desire to be close with your partner. Now, if you're needing to set limits with your partner, one of the challenges sometimes comes up is whenever I want to talk about a boundary with my partner, they get defensive. They get to a place where they just shut down and they don't listen. And they always ask me the question, what do you recommend, Stuart, of how we should do this? How should I talk about this with my partner so they don't get defensive? My advice, and a lot of couples therapists' advice, and I've done a little bit of research on what I've been recommending to people, and it seems like that's something that I hear from a lot of professionals in this area, is you want to do it in a threefold way. It's like making a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. Peanut butter jelly sandwich, the best way to make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich from my standpoint is 2 slices of bread, 2 peanut butter, and jelly in between the two. That's what I'm going to recommend here. What you want to do is talk about the issue first with a compliment, complimenting your partner, complimenting your relationship, complimenting them in a way that they make you feel loved. And then in the middle, talk about the thing you'd like to change. And after you talk about that, follow it up immediately with another compliment and letting them know how thankful you are that you have a relationship with someone who cares enough about you that they want to hear what your concerns are. More often than not, that then becomes a much easier dialogue. An example of that is if you're trying to change the nature of your sexual relationship and there's something that's happening, let's say that for the most part, you have sex in the evening, and that's a problem. You'd rather have sex in the morning. And your partner has been unwilling to do that, and you really need to set a limit because at night, what happens is you go to bed too late, you can't get to work on time, it's hard for you to wake up, and you just want to make some changes. So you could start out by saying, I love having sex with you. It's really something that I really appreciate about our relationship, how intimate we are, how affectionate we are, but that I really would rather do more of this in the morning because I can be more present and responsive. And I think that would then allow our sexual relationship to be more fulfilling for both of us. And I know that you're someone that you care about how I feel about our sex life. Do you see what that does? That opens someone up. He hears or she hears the concern, and we're followed again about that. One of the hardest issues for a lot of couples are issues about relationships with clear-cut parameters about other people, particularly something that has to do with emotional affairs. And so often, there are a lot of things for a lot of couples that unless we have clear understood boundaries, there's this gray area that can happen that then creates tremendous problems for the boundary of other people. And there's issues of social media these days that we have to talk about. How do we define cheating? If you have a friend of the opposite sex and you're talking to your friend about your relationship with your wife or husband, is that considered cheating? Do the two of you know that that's happening? I've done over the past few months some podcasts on infidelity, and I also have done one on emotional affairs. And I recommend you go back and listen to that to get more of information on that particular topic. But when we're talking about boundaries, what we're really talking about is needing to have the conversation before the issue comes up, because you want this to be a clear, specific, understood boundary that both of you agree to. And so there never is a surprise that says, I didn't know this was a problem for you. I didn't know my going out to dinner with my secretary and not coming home till 11 o'clock intoxicated after being with her for dinner one-on-one was a problem that you would have. I'm shocked that you would not trust me then. And the response is, you should have known. And what I say is, unless you've had this specific clear-cut conversation, people don't know. And you have to make sure that there isn't those misunderstandings. Particularly, I find this with people who travel for business. And traveling for business means a lot of social things that go on, and you're in a hotel. And there's a phone call that happens, and what happens in that phone call at 11 o'clock at night, you're not in your room. And then when later it's learned that where you were in a nightclub or were at the bar with your female associate, someone that you spend lots of time with, and then all of a sudden we have a dialogue between two people that's talking about affairs. And whether there's an affair going on or not, what is learned for the most part is that there's a total misunderstanding of what's appropriate, what's not appropriate, because the dialogue never occurred. And you have to have these dialogues. This should happen early in your relationship, but so many of you have never had the dialogue of boundaries that I don't care if you've been married 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, 50 years, it's time to have it. It's time to be clear about what your boundaries are. And because the more you can set up these boundaries so that there's agreements between the two of you, the better it is. And there are many different kinds of boundaries as we're talking about. Emotional boundaries is one of them. Unconditional love needs to be defined, what that means. One of the questions that I like asking people is there such a thing as unconditional love? Is unconditional love lived out day by day in a relationship? Are you living up to your vows, meaning for better or for worse? When your partner is doing things that you don't like, do you automatically go to, maybe I should divorce my partner, in your head? Or do you say, this is something that I need to deal with and talk directly with my partner? If your partner is behaving badly, how do you handle it? Do you talk about it? Are you as committed as you are when things are going well? That doesn't mean you have to tolerate their bad behavior, because sometimes we do have to set limits. Unconditional love isn't about accepting inappropriate behavior or violation of boundaries. It's about being committed to work through the issues with your partner. What about honesty? Can you say that the honesty level of your relationship is more toward the positive than the dishonesty? Honesty will help sustain a relationship. If you don't have trust and respect, what does that do to how you would define your relationship as whether the two of you are in this world together and you have someone in your life that has your back? I would suggest that wouldn't be the case. And not having an honest relationship is part of how we build very negative characteristics with each of us, which includes insecurity on the relationship, jealousy, mistrust, and most importantly, a lack of respect. Because in order to have your relationship being defined at the boundary, which is about being faithful, being intimate, being vulnerable with only one person in the world, and that being your partner, has to do with all these external influences that may require a lot of reassurance, but most importantly, requires you seeing your partner as willing to do whatever it takes to keep your relationship on a positive path, and nothing and no one is more important than you. And unless you have that open dialogue, open communication, where both of you are talking about what you need from a relationship and knowing that your partner trusts you enough that they're going to share, even if they are having feelings coming up for someone else, they don't just put it aside and say, it's not a big deal. They begin to talk to you about things that are missing for them in your relationship, and the two of them are working on this together in those not so good times. Maybe we can even define it as the worst time, from better or worse, but that both of you are doing this together. And that everyone knows that honesty has to be the basic foundation of the hierarchy of needs in your relationship. And part of that criteria is also having some self-control. Self-control not only about other people in terms of infidelity, but also self-control about what do we say to our partners when we're upset with them. What about rudeness? Is kindness the most important characteristic of your marriage? One of the things that I like to jokingly say, and I've said this in some of my couples weekends as well as other platforms, one thing that really irritated me initially is when I turned to my wife and I said, what's the thing about me that you love the most? What is it about me that really is a positive for you? And my hope was she would say, you're the sexiest man alive, even more than George Clooney, because George Clooney to my wife is incredibly sexy. And she said, not that I was sexy, which really depressed me for a little bit, but what she said was, you're the kindest person that I know. You're someone I know that will be kind to me for my entire life, and that you have a strong aspect of you, which is about commitment to our relationship, and that even throughout all our trials and tribulations that we may have, you'll always be kind. I wanted to be sexy, but then I thought about it. Kindness is long-lasting. Kindness is something that will take you through the years, take you through the time. And then when I realized it, boy, did I feel loved. Boy, did I feel important. Boy, did I recognize that my wife saw that the emotional boundaries in our marriage would always be in line with one another. And that is so very important. Having positive conversations about each other is an essential part of a relationship. And I think when we talk about communication and the communication boundaries, positiveness is one of those. The other aspect is looking inwardly instead of outwardly. So many of us look to our partners and say, if only they were different, then things would be okay. I believe that it's more important in recognizing that you can't change other people. You can't change your partner, but you can create within yourself you becoming the best partner that your partner ever had. And that in a marriage, if we look more about what can I do to make this relationship the best relationship out there, you'll be much more successful. That kind of boundary that both of you commit to not looking outwardly, but more inwardly, to mold ourselves to be the most loving, caring partner your partner ever had. In a marriage, if you do that, you will create for the two of you something quite special and exceptional. We also have to work hard to learn how to forgive and truly forgive. And this is not an easy thing for most of us. To forgive your partner for some of the things that they have done in times of conflict or even with regard to relationship injuries, we need to become humble enough to forgive our partners and let go. Letting go is not always easy, but critical for a relationship that's going to put some of these injuries behind you. Unless the two of you look at each other with a different lens, every interaction that you have will be perceived within that perspective of your partner being that person that's untrustworthy that hurt you. I want the two of you to take off those sunglasses, look at each other with a fresh new set of eyes, and believe that you're with that one person in the world that would never hurt you. I know sometimes that's not very realistic, but if you work at creating those positive experiences where forgiveness is an essential part of your marriage and the best part, that the two of you are committed to one another to always make your relationship with your partner more important than being right, protecting yourself to a place where you don't give your partner the ability to have a do-over. In closing, what I would like to do is to give you a summary of some of the relationship needs having to do with boundaries. One of the first ones I'd like to mention has to do with you need to respect each other's privacy. What that means is you don't check and open your partner's emails. You don't look at the conversation or text chats. You don't do anything that would suggest to you that you don't trust your partner, and that even if we're in a relationship, even if we're in a marriage, there are things that you don't always have to share. And that doing things and chatting with people is something that you can just really have that be that thing that is all yours. Now, if you're in a relationship where trust is an issue, that definitely has to be worked on. But one of the real clear boundaries for most couples is that there is privacy that is okay. The second thing is that you don't tolerate people interfering with your relationship. That includes family, friends, or anything that there's a boundary that gets crossed. If that is happening, both you and your partner have to put a stop to that immediately. And that is a very complicated issue, particularly if it's around family. And that's a dialogue that some couples can have quite easily, and some have a very big challenge with that. And if you do have a challenge with other people in your relationship, that very well may be something that couples counseling can be quite helpful with. Third is you get to maintain your own independence, because what you want is to be able to translate both independent things that you do, and they're just about you and your friends and your activities, and what you do and share with your partner. So there's a boundary that you need to set, and the two of you should also have a boundary that says we have a good amount of independence and togetherness, and that conversation needs to occur. The next one that I would suggest has to do with finances. And I've actually done a whole podcast on that, and you could look back in the archives if you haven't listened to that podcast. Your finances should be handled in a way that makes both of you comfortable. Finances is an interesting one because what it usually has a lot to do with is family background and how money was dealt with. Did you have money in the past? Did you grow up in a poor family or were you well-to-do? But the most important thing is that you want to have a clear sense. My philosophy with finances is that it doesn't matter who does what. It's still our money. And that the two of you should really have an attitude that says how you deal with this is something that is a shared responsibility and a shared agreement. Do you have the woman stay home as a stay-at-home mom, and do you have stay-at-home dads? Those conversations that have to do with finances have to be something that's discussed, and there needs to be clear boundaries to what's appropriate, what's not appropriate. One of the more important pieces of a boundary is that you don't break your partner's boundaries. That when the boundary is set, the two of you agree, this is a clear rule that the two of you have, and these boundaries are respected. Another boundary that I highly recommend for couples is that you treat each other with love and respect. That is a highly important one, obviously, and I don't think there's much that we need to say about it other than you need to make some clear definitions of what respect looks like. The one that sometimes gets a lot of couples in trouble has to do with your sexual relationship. And what the understanding has to be is that sex is not a given. That having a sexual intimate relationship means that the two of you are together agreeing that this is appropriate at a given time. And that no means no. If either of you are not interested, the sex doesn't happen. There's no forcing it. There's no manipulation having to do with it. Also, the one that also needs to be talked about is sex is never used as a weapon against one another. The one that sometimes gets couples in trouble is, and it goes really back to the respect one. We have a boundary, an agreement that we don't treat people in our lives or even strangers in inappropriate, cruel ways. We don't make fun of people. That jokes are only about humor, not about someone's person, about their life circumstances, and that the two of you talk about humor, what's okay to make fun of and what's okay not to make fun of. One of the boundaries I highly also recommend is that decision-making is done jointly. Even in traditional families, I recommend that the decision-making of the things you do with the kids, the things you do in your home, are something that the two of you are made jointly and no one is strong-arming the other person. The last one that I'm going to mention has to do with honesty, and that honesty is a given. That even white lies are still lies. And I highly recommend you two really have a conversation about all these things. There's nothing that's off limits. There's nothing that you can't talk about. And the most critical piece here is that the two of you want a relationship in which both of you love one another. Both of you describe this relationship as you have each other's back. And unless your boundaries are clear, direct, and adhered to, meaning that you respect each other's boundaries, your relationship is going to be a challenge. if you have that as an integral part of your relationship will be one in which both of you feel so good about it and know that you're with that one person in the world that you get to spend the rest of your life with. Take care, have a great week, and we'll talk to you again in a couple weeks on the Couples Expert Podcast. And of course, please stay connected.
Thank you for listening. This episode has ended, but your journey continues. Head over to www.thecouplesexperts.com to access all the links and resources mentioned in this episode, as well as bonus content exclusive to podcast listeners. Enjoyed this episode? Why not hit subscribe now and never miss an episode?